I spoke to Representative Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, someone who's emerging as a leading voice on foreign policy. He has some very strong legislation he's proposed to help the people of Hong Kong, and he has some very clear thinking about what he sees as an emerging Cold War with China. Hope you'll give it a listen or a watch. Thanks.
This is Luke Knittig, and you're in the arena with leaders and citizens who take character-based action. In the Arena is a proud member of the Democracy Group podcast network. For more information, visit democracygroup.org.
Well, it's a true honor to be in the arena with Representative Mike Gallagher. He's a U.S. Congressman in his second term, I guess pretty close to finishing, well into your second term here, finishing it up. Represents the Green Bay area of Wisconsin. Tremendous credentials, former Marine officer, has a PhD on the House Armed Services Committee, infrastructure, transportation, a bunch of other things. But first, thank you very much for joining us, and then I'll put our first question to you. Thank you for coming into the arena.
Happy to be with you. It's an honor.
You have a particular, you got a lot of things on your plate, but something really on your mind right now. My understanding is you plan to introduce, along with, I believe, Congressman John Curtis and some others, some very specific legislation to do with the freedom-loving folks of Hong Kong. So tell us more about that. What's the problem you're trying to take on there?
Yeah, well, John Curtis and I are calling this the Hong Kong Airlift Act for now. And basically, the idea is to provide priority refugee status to Hong Kongers who are facing Chinese Communist Party persecution. We're working through the details right now, but with the potential Tiananmen-like purge looming in Hong Kong, I think the free world needs to step up and save as many Hong Kongers as possible. It's not just the right thing to do. I think, in terms of our own interests, Hong Kong is one of the most educated populations in the world. It has high-tech skills, a love of freedom, and a hatred for the Chinese Communist Party. And any nation, I think, therefore, would be lucky to have Hong Kongers call it home. And what's more, I think this would be a huge blow to the CCP to lose out on this talented population. It would hurt them financially as well. And so I think saving Hong Kongers is a great power competition slam dunk. I'm thrilled to see that our friends in the UK are similarly extending a lifeline to the millions of Hong Kongers with British ties. And I hope nations across the free world can join in, because at the end of the day, I think the only way we win this long-term competition with the Chinese Communist Party is if we're working hand in hand with our allies around the world.
Interesting that you mentioned UK, because that was going to be my next question. And if I have it right, Senator Ben Sasse in the Senate, I don't know if it's similar or not, he's proposing, I think, what he calls asylum. But we're coming up on next week, Ronald Reagan's anniversary of his speech about democracy not being relegated to the ash heap of history and not being such a fragile flower. And I've heard you talk a little bit about that. I think these threads connect directly to what you're taking on here.
Well, yeah, I think Reagan really set the standard for what I would call not just public diplomacy and public rhetoric, but I would call ideological warfare, doing it very effectively throughout his administration. In particular, I would highlight the speech he gave at Fudan University in China midway through his 2 terms, and also I think what is the masterpiece of ideological warfare, his speech at Moscow State University in 1988 after his 4th and final meeting with Gorbachev. And you read that speech today, and it is both a powerful testament to American values and a simple explanation for American values, but it also brilliantly, I think, draws commonalities between the American people and the Russian people, and the way in which Reagan uses Russian literature, referencing Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, Russian pop culture, in order to create a connection between himself and the next generation of Russian citizens is really brilliant. And I think we need to rediscover that lost art today of ideological warfare. I think we've had some recent examples of how you can do it well. My friend Matt Pottinger gave a brilliant speech regarding the May 4th movement in China recently that didn't really receive the attention it deserves. It's been criticized by Chinese state TV, which tells you he was probably onto something. But just one example of how we can really do this effectively and how we can highlight our values, which I think, in addition to our allies, is one of the secret weapons, or not so secret weapons, we hold in this competition with China.
So, well, two things come to mind here. I want to circle back to the legislation first off. So the UK one, and this is all focused on that national security law that I guess is being drafted, and it gets back to the point that you just made. This is about the Chinese Communist Party, not about the Chinese people, in the same way that Reagan wasn't taking on the Russians; he was taking on, their leadership. So I guess speak to that. And then what do you see? The UK they're going to trigger theirs if this law doesn't come about the right way. Is yours kind of the same way? And you're not new to this issue. I mean, the Chinese have backed off once. What are you trying to make happen with it this time?
Yeah, well, I think so. Having talked with some of my friends in the UK this week, as I understand it, they're going to revise their immigration rules so that Hong Kongers, should the Chinese Communist Party go through with its proposed national security law, that it would allow Hong Kongers to come in. Similarly, I mean, it's analogous, but it's not identical. We're trying to extend asylum protections for those facing persecution in Hong Kong. And as for what we're trying to achieve, well, I think we want to send a message loud and clear that while, we're not talking about military support to Hong Kong, in terms of our values, we want to stand as much as we can with the people of Hong Kong, the people that have been peacefully protesting in the streets. And my hope is that if nothing else, this will be a wake-up call so that we ensure that what's happening in Hong Kong isn't replicated in places like Taiwan, which I do believe is a legacy issue for General Secretary Xi Jinping. And at a much broader level, I just would say I think the coronavirus crisis has really brought the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party into stark relief in the US and the UK and just across the free world. There's some fascinating polling from the Henry Jackson Society, a conservative UK think tank, that really speaks volume about the current debate. According to the poll, 80% of Brits want the Johnson government to push for an international inquiry into the Chinese government's handling of coronavirus. 74% think China is to blame for allowing the virus to spread. And interestingly, in that same poll, they found that by a margin of 40 to 27%, Britons oppose Huawei's inclusion into their 5G network. And so, and conservative voters oppose it by a wider margin. So I really think we have an opportunity to, starting with that Five Eyes alliance, us, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, really to bring the free world closer together and form an alliance, a united front, if you will, that could stand up to the CCP's aggression.
I see. I mean, just recently you've really stood up for Australia, who's facing some pressure when you talk about that Five Eyes coalition. Real short segue. At the McCain Institute, we have a program called the Human Rights Defenders Program, and it strikes me that your legislation would kind of have the same effect. Sure, it hits China to lose that kind of talent, but when we pull these defenders out and kind of reset them, provide transition assistance, it allows their voice to stay in the fight. And I guess we might see a situation where folks just can't keep their voice in the fight in Hong Kong, and you're giving them another option. So there's that. And then some of what you're talking about, to me, seems to relate pretty closely to you being on this China task force in Congress. Do I have that right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say, I mean, I think this is an enduring legacy of Senator John McCain. I mean, the idea that we need to put and I would connect it to Reagan's foreign policy, right? The idea that we need to put human rights at the forefront of our foreign policy, that by leveraging our values, we can actually have an outsized effect on the world. I mean, that is something I learned from Senator John McCain. I was privileged to travel with him on a few occasions. And that, I think, is something you're seeing a really interesting coalescence on the left and the right on right now, at least in terms of China policy. So, for example, the recently passed a bill sanctioning the Chinese Communist Party for its treatment, its forced labor of Uyghur Muslims. I mean, that passed, I think, 425 to 1. Perhaps the loudest voice on that has been Ilhan Omar, a very progressive and controversial figure in the House, but on this issue is aligned with hawkish Republicans like Marco Rubio. So I think it just shows that we have a real opportunity here to make this a bipartisan effort, that this could be a foundation for a long-term foreign policy that is rooted in bipartisanship. And certainly I hope that's true with the China task force you mentioned. Right now it's a Republican only exercise, which is unfortunate. My hope is that Nancy Pelosi will reverse her policy and allow some of my Democratic colleagues, particularly the younger, newer members, to join it, because this doesn't have to be a partisan thing. Figuring out how we smartly push back against the CCP's aggression, figuring out how we protect human rights, how we protect our economy, how we protect our allies in Indo-PACOM is not a partisan issue. And so I'm excited about the direction we're heading on the task force, but I hope that the Democrats will join it as well.
Yeah, when I looked it up just to try to do my homework, you see the topics there: national security, economics, energy, ideology, competition. Gosh, I mean, that's something everybody's got to be involved with. There's no two ways about that. I heard you, and I don't want to sound I won't sound glib, but flip about this. But I've heard you kind of say we got to remind ourselves we're the good guys here. That's kind of first and foremost.
Well, listen, I think that may be the most ignored aspect of this. I mean, I don't believe this idea of a foreign policy consensus during the Cold War. I think if you actually look at the empirical record, there were brutal debates, not just between the left and the right, but within the parties over the right variant of containment, various aspects of containment. But I do think there really wasn't a question that we were the good guys, right? I think even isolationist Republicans, and it was largely from Republicans back in the 50s, and, Democrats agreed, Scoop Jackson Democrats agreed on the idea that America and the free world were the good guys. I mean, putting aside the fact that there was communist infiltration of our government and there were some fellow travelers, I think by and large, Americans shared a sense that of the righteousness of our cause, right? Not only that we could win, but that we deserve to win, that the world would be a better place if America prevailed in this competition against the Soviet Union. I'm not sure we have that same sense today. I'm worried by a lot of what I'm seeing, and I think it's easy to forget how lucky we are to be Americans and what a force for good America has been throughout its history, but in particularly the history of the latter half of the 20th century and the 21st century. And of course, we make mistakes, but we tend to retain this remarkable capacity for self-correction, for fixing those mistakes, for learning from failures. We don't do it elegantly, we don't do it quickly, we don't do it efficiently, but over time, we tend to self-correct and do the right thing. What's the Churchill saying that everyone loves quoting? Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other alternatives. And so I think as we try and better understand who we're competing with in the Chinese Communist Party, understand their sources of conduct, we need to spend as much, if not more time, understanding and appreciating what is exceptional about America. What are the enduring sources of our strength? Because ultimately, that's how we're going to win. And if people don't believe in the righteousness of our cause, I just fear we're doomed to failure from the start.
If you allow me just an observation, I think sometimes you wonder if it's, you hear, Cold War analogies, which I think are useful, imperfect, but, what you compare, we need to compare ideas more. I think that, I grew up, graduated West Point with the prospect of the Soviet horde still pouring through the Fulda Gap. But when you thought of the East and the Cold War, you kind of thought of drab, gray buildings and all kinds of bad stuff. When you think of China and other places, there's a little bit of flash, there's a little bit of bling there, right? There's a little bit of technology and other things, and I think that can be distracting in a harmful way.
Well, indeed, if I could add to that, because I think you're onto something. This I actually think is why General Secretary Xi is a much more formidable adversary in some ways than the Soviet Union was, because he has studied the Soviet collapse and concluded that part of the cause was insufficient commitment to not just the party, but to the ideology. And he's trying to frame the CCP's ideology in a way that could be palatable to the rest of the world, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so I think in some ways the real risk is a very insidious one. It's the idea that people around the world would start to say, well, you know what? What's wrong with the government controlling our access to the internet? What's wrong with the government being able to record every aspect of our daily lives? What's wrong with the model of the Chinese Communist Party? And once people start to go down that road, that is very concerning. But Xi, I think, has certainly taken the lesson that when faith in the party flags, his entire system risks collapse. And therefore, his challenge is to continually convince 1.4 billion people that the Chinese Communist Party should stay in power and that foreign governments should partner with his ethnocentric totalitarian government. And that's no small task. So listen, I think we can win. We're obviously the good guys, but it's going to take some convincing of some of our fellow citizens, of our allies in the early stages of this competition.
I want to pick up on citizens and I guess companies as well. I think it was yesterday, HSBC, big bank, UK focused. They've said, hey, we're okay with what's shaping with this national security law. How does that strike you?
Well, just to the extent I understand HSBC's statement, were they in favor of decoupling from China or the opposite? They think we need to maintain our engagement. Sorry, I didn't see the story.
Well, and I put you on the spot here, and I may not have the specifics, but the way I read it, they said, look, we want to carry on, and we think it's okay that China wants to put a national security law in place.
Well, I just think it's naive and short-sighted to think that we could somehow carry on business as usual or further bet on a deepening engagement with the Chinese Communist Party is the best way to moderate its behavior. I mean, we have 3 decades of running that experiment, and it hasn't worked out. And I do think there's a short term or naive view emerging in some parts of the foreign policy establishment that says the tension in the relationship right now is just a function of the personalities, right? It's a Trump versus Xi thing, and therefore, if you remove those personalities, it could go back to a more constructive paradigm. I think that's totally wrong. I think the tensions are primarily a function of the aggression of the party, accelerated under Xi, but that direction was happening prior to Xi's rise in 2013. And I just don't think it makes any sense for us to go back to the status quo ante. And to the specific point about decoupling or financial disengagement, I think what we've learned in the coronavirus crisis is that we are too dependent, dangerously dependent upon China for the production of basic pharmaceuticals, basic medical devices, but the same is true for rare earths, for certain advanced technologies, semiconductors. And so I think we will, over the next decade, have to go through this painful process of selectively and responsibly decoupling key parts of our economy from China. And I think it probably starts with our capital markets. It starts with Wall Street being willing to stand up to fraudulent Chinese companies, or at least being willing to subject those companies to the same reporting standards that we subject our own American companies to.
I mean, I'm going to kind of get you to the, how does this play on Main Street kind of question in a second, but that to me, makes pretty darn good sense. Me and my asides, but a couple months ago, I tried to pull together McCain Institute debate on China, and it was kind of framed about how much should we cooperate and how much should we compete. And the China crowd's so nuanced, and people wanted to kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth so much. I had a hard time getting a debate together. I think it's probably even easier now, but to me, it seems like, boy, the how you compete side of things is where we really need to be focused.
Well, you can if you want to have a debate about whether we're in a new Cold War with China, I'll be happy to be on the side suggesting that we are. And there's been some counterpoints by people that are very smart, Richard Haas and Robert Zellick on the other side. So I think we could get a good debate going on together. I think it's interesting at a time when most people, I think, agree with the premise that China is our foremost competitor, that Indo-PACOM is the priority theater, probably in contrast to the theaters that you prioritize when you are on active duty, and certainly that I prioritize as a Marine who thought the Middle East was everything. There are some fault lines emerging, right? I mean, there is a question of how much we should emphasize human rights. I think there's a question of, how aggressive we need to be on economic decoupling. And I think trade is an unresolved question, right? With or TPP, how do we form bilateral partnerships with our allies in Indo-PACOM in order to counter the economic threat? And I think perhaps a fourth and perhaps thorniest bucket of this is how do we rid our own system of what I would call corrupt CCP influence, right? We have a lot of United Front work happening domestically in the United States, and the Chinese Communist Party is very good at elite capture, in some cases buying off elites, former senators, former members of the House, former high-level defense officials in order to perpetuate its narratives. That's going to be something that we have to tackle without going overboard into the realm of McCarthyism.
Right, shine a light on it, just kind of make your intents clear, and if the intents aren't the right, aren't healthy, then hey, deal with it. That makes a lot of sense. It's pretty clear anybody that watches this, we'll do probably both audio and video, that that you support the Badgers and you're tied to your home pretty strongly and clearly. But standard question, I suppose. But what do folks in your district say? And I know you're focused a lot more than just on foreign affairs, but you've become a leading voice on that. How do you get it across to them, and then how do they take it?
Well, sorry I don't have any West Point gear in here. I should confess, I'm a Navy guy. I'm a sea power guy. I have nothing against land power, but the national defense strategy is a sea power heavy strategy right now. There's a lot of water in the Indo-Pacific. So just throwing that out there for all my Army friends.
Well, I'm very ecumenical nowadays.
I think, so it's interesting. I think the polling suggests what is true, which is that most of my constituents have an increasingly negative view of China. I think it's incumbent upon public officials like me to make sure that hostility is directed towards the Chinese Communist Party and not the Chinese people, as you aptly put it at the beginning of our conversation. And we still haven't gotten there. I don't think it's yet quite as palpable as perhaps the concern there was in 2015 and 2016 over the threat of terrorist groups internationally. And of course, these are very different threats. I'm not equating them. But I think people sense economically China's a threat. I think there is a recognition that China's accession to the WTO has been devastating for the Midwest. But I think we need to do a better job of explaining, okay, why don't we want to live in a world where China dominates its near abroad and is increasingly the global powerhouse, right? Why does that world look bad? And to tie it back to what we talked about with us being the good guys, why is it worth investing money in a world where America is the leader of the free world and we remain the world's sole superpower? And again, McCain was great at that. That's something McCain was always evangelizing for that gospel. If I could tell one quick John McCain story.
Absolutely.
First of all, he loved telling Marine jokes at my expense and the expense of every Marine he met. But I was fortunate. I was on an Armed Services Committee trip to Vietnam, and he happened to be on a trip there before he passed away. This must have been 2017, I want to say, if my timing's right. And we were in Hanoi at the same time. And he gave us a tour of Hanoi Hilton, where obviously he spent 5 years imprisoned and tortured. It was just one of the most powerful experiences of my life. But just as powerful was to see the reception he got from the Vietnamese people. I mean, he was a celebrity there. He was mobbed everywhere he went. And Vietnam, largely, the views of America among the populace are very positive. And to see how far that's come, just given the darkest days of Vietnam, was incredibly powerful. And to see how important Senator McCain took the job of being a legislator and the job of public diplomacy, how much it means to some of these officials to meet with Americans. I mean, that was a lesson I'll never forget. And I just felt really privileged to have that experience before he passed away.
You get that across very well. My dad was drafted and served in Vietnam, and to me, it is, you think about how things have progressed there on a different, path to be sure. But I think that's an important point. And I can remember being in Afghanistan when we had, let's just talk about, this week when we're recording this anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, D-Day just ahead. Pretty rough week, I think, by any account in the U.S. But I think of being in Kabul during some very serious riots, and then 2 months later, some amazing meetings and comings together, and we even had a cricket match of all things. So that's my stories. I'm not trying to get into that, but you have a real intel background. So I'm not really looking for your kind of near-term assessment or an intelligence assessment. But what are you going to be looking at and kind of tracking over the next, I don't know, say 2-3 months?
Yeah, well, I think what's most on my mind right now is, I spent the last year working with Senator Angus King on this, what's called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And we basically were charged to take a comprehensive look at where we are in cyber and develop a strategy for how we can do better. And so we released our report in March. And so I'm increasingly obsessed with the U.S.-China competition in the cyber domain. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to how do we recruit the best and the brightest to work with the U.S. government. And so by extension, I think that's a question of how do we bridge this gap between Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense. And so I think that's one area that deserves a lot more attention and where we can do better in the United States. I am just kind of as a hobby obsessed with any area where there is bipartisan collaboration on the U.S.-China issue and where I think we can forge that enduring consensus that will exist regardless of how the presidential election happens. But me, as a sea power guy and as a navalist in Congress, I really think we have an opportunity now that we're out of the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, to field some INF non-compliant missile systems that, in concert with a bunch of smaller ships, will allow us to do what we need to do in that region in terms of deterring the PLA Navy and the CCP more broadly on a day-to-day basis. And so those are some areas where I'm obsessed. And then I have a variety of domestic initiatives, but I just, in terms of what we're talking about, those are some things I'm paying attention to.
Well, it sounds like you got plenty to keep you busy. I appreciate you coming on the arena. I know so many others will, and we'll catch up to this. And best of luck on your legislation and everything you're pushing forward. And we hope you'll let us circle back and keep up with you on it.
Well, hey, it was an honor. I owe a lot to the gentleman who used to do my job, Ambassador Congressman Mark Green. He is an incredible guy. And Mark Green says, you need to do a podcast. I do a podcast. So we're really excited to see the collaboration and where the McCain Institute's going in the coming years and months.
Congressman Gallagher, thanks again. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced by Patrick McCann and Justin Kessler. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, tell your friends, or leave a review.